Okay, so far you've seen how we can instantiate classes and call methods on those instances of the classes or those objects. In this next step, we're going to look at how to call methods from a class outside of an instance altogether. And this will also be an example of how we might refactor our code to pull out some of this logic into a separate class altogether. So go to your resource pack and open up the fourth step, which is called index.php, adding static methods, copy it, and paste it over the code that's in your index.php file and save it. Okay, so in some of the previous videos, we talked about a scenario where the validation tools that we've built for our forms would end up being useful to us in other scenarios too, like importing content into a database and validating that data before it ends up in the database. So in this code, what we've done is created a new class called validator, and it's right here. Now, whereas our form and page classes are pretty concrete, it's really easy to see that those are objects. The validator is sort of our own invention. It is an object, we're calling it a validator, but it's not as physically clear an object as the others. So I just wanted to point out that this is still valid. This validator is like a little machine that we've built that does something important, and it encapsulates an idea rather well. Inside of this class, we have two functions. Notice that we don't have any constructor. That's because we don't actually plan on using instances of the validator class. So we have our method notEmpty, which checks to see if the value being passed to this method is empty, and it returns false if so. Otherwise, it returns true. And then we have isValidEmail, which does the same logic that we had before in our validate method in our form object. And this just checks for the existence of an @ symbol inside of the value and returns false if it's not there. So something you haven't seen before is this static keyword, at least not in the context of a function within a class. In our original code, we had a static variable that persisted from one function call to another for the form number incrementer. This use of the static keyword is different though. You have to kind of separate the two ideas. This says that we can call the method of this class without actually having an instance of it. Without this static keyword, we would have to call isValidEmail from a validator class. So we would do something like create a validator variable and say it equals new validator, and then we could call these methods on it. But let's take a look at how we can call these methods without the instance. So this validator is used inside of the validate function, inside of our form class. So remember, we loop through each of the validations set on each input, we switch based on it, and we have notEmpty and isValidEmail. So now instead of having our logic in here, we have it in our validator class. And to call the methods without an instance, we simply have the name of the class, 2 colons, and then the name of the method. So let's contrast this with how we call a method from an instance. If we scroll down to the bottom, you see we create a new page object here, and then we call the method by using the dash and then the arrow and then the method name. So it's a similar structure, except instead of the dash and arrow, we're using 2 colons, and instead of a variable name, we're using the name of the class. If we scroll up back to the validate method here, you see we use the notEmpty validator here and pass it a value, and then we use the isValidEmail method here and pass it the value here. This is also the first time in these videos that you've seen a method take a parameter as well. Now, just because we pass this parameter into the class doesn't mean that it becomes a property. So again, the difference between a variable and a property is that the property is accessible between all of the different methods. So the this settings variable here is a property within this class, but value is just a variable, and you wouldn't be able to access this value from the other methods unless you made it a property. The same thing happens when we pass a parameter into a method. In order to make that a property, we'd have to start with this, and then a dash arrow, and then say value equals value, for example. So this should look familiar to you, this double colon. You saw it before in our glue module when we looked at the function that was designated to the routing to our Hello World page. If we jump back to our file browser and we go back to our glue module, so I'm going to go back to our Drupal root directory, expand modules, and then take a look at our glue.routing.yml, you see those double colons here. So in this case, we're looking at the name of the class and then the method that's going to be called. So that part should make a little bit more sense now. The rest of this still looks a little weird probably, but we're going to be covering that shortly. Okay, I'm going to close this out.